Welcome all. Today we are extremely privileged to have with us Dr. Rana Mitter, who is the director of the China Center at the University of Oxford. He has published extensively on the political and cultural history of 20th century China. His interests include the Republican period, the Cold War, and Sino-Japanese relations. And his publications include The Manchurian Myth, Nationalism, Resistance, and Collaboration in Modern China, and A Bitter Revolution, China's Struggle with the Modern World, for which he was named the Young Academic Author of the Year by the Times Higher Education Supplement in 2005. We are extremely grateful to have him here today with us. The focus of today's discussion is going to be India-China relations, recent events, and taking a long look at the history between these two nations from perspectives that we really don't talk about, be it cultural, the people-to-people connect. And that is the perspective with which we are going to approach this discussion. Professor Mitra, it's an honor to have you here with us today.
Huge pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, sir. And I want to basically start this discussion by asking you, what are the broad cultural connections that exist between India and China from both a historical perspective, and if these historical connections, have they been upgraded, have they changed? If you could elaborate on that.
Well, I think it's fair to say that India and China, which of course are both terms that have changed their meaning significantly over the centuries, are societies that have always had very significant connections to one another. One of the earliest, and one that's still immensely important, is of course the link that Buddhism provided. And Buddhism emerged in India, of course, a very, very long time ago, but it actually only arrived in China at about the year 100 of the Common Era. And it came in large part actually through that part of the world that sits between the two countries, between India and China, what we now think of as Central Asia. The great monk Kumarajiva, who was responsible for the translation of huge numbers of original Buddhist texts in Pali into Chinese. And those texts are still used in China today by Buddhist worshippers. So when Chinese worshippers are speaking and chanting a particular scripture in a Buddhist temple in China today, they're actually chanting essentially those transcriptions and those translations created by that cultural link of nearly 2,000 years ago. So that has a very long history. But of course, the modern history is probably the one that is more in the minds of most people in India, China, and the rest of the world today. Let's be honest, the history has sometimes been an unhappy one. The War of 1962 between the two countries still remains very vividly remembered in India, perhaps more so than in China even, it must be said. But it's also fair to say that there were also periods of real cultural interaction. So nationalist leadership in both countries looked very much to, each country looked to the other to try and gain inspiration for the struggle for national independence. Nehru was a close or a decent friend anyway of Chiang Kai-shek, one of the early Chinese nationalist leaders. And a little later on, of course, you also have the emergence actually in a story that's been told by Professor Arunabh Ghosh of Harvard University, of how Chinese and Indian statisticians, mathematicians, worked with each other in the 1950s, in the first decade of independence for both countries, in a sense, to actually work together on shared science before the 1962 war. So there are actually India-China historical connections, both ancient and modern, if you know where to look, in an awful lot of places.
Thank you for that. Speaking of the 20th century, the Republican period of China, both India and China have a brutal colonial past. They both had their dealings with the British, they both had their dealings with the imperialist powers. However, how is there a difference in how both the countries see and deal with this colonial past in today's time? And how has their experience of the colonial past shaped their interactions with the world order, shaped how they go ahead interacting with each other?
I think you're right that both India and China are deeply, deeply shaped by their very traumatic, very turbulent encounter with colonialism and the struggle for national independence in both cases. But I think that the aftermath has been quite different in many ways. In some ways, it's fair to say that the ruling class in India in the independence era, Nehru and his successors and the Congress Party, and even some of those who were in opposition for many decades, in some ways were shaped by their experience of being, of course, subjects of the British Empire, resistors against the British Empire, but also in some ways people who had been shaped by that empire as well. So, the education at Cambridge for Oxford for members of the Gandhi family, for instance, at least at the elite level. And of course, the spread of the English language within India, still immensely widely used today, is one of those legacies that unexpectedly, and not through any intent of the British, but nonetheless conveniently, has given India one sort of leg up into global status in the current era of globalization and the service economy that's being created. China has not been in the same position. The British actually were very present in China too. Shanghai, no less than Bombay or Calcutta, was one of the great British colonial cities of the pre-war era, but it's never remembered in that way because, of course, China's history ended up being so separated from the West. But I think another factor, and a rather more important one from the Chinese point of view, is why the history has been so different, which is that China didn't just have one colonial conqueror, as the Indians did with the British, or the French to some extent and the Portuguese, but mainly the British. In China, everyone came to China and, in a phrase that Chinese nationalists used, tried to slice it up like a melon. In other words, each one took a little part of it: the British, the French, the Americans, and of course the Japanese. And that, I think, is the main reason why actually memory is very different in China. I have a new book coming out actually this autumn, China's Good War, which will be out in September, for the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II in Asia. And when you look at that event and see the devastation that the war with Japan during World War II wreaked upon China, you will see why actually it's the Japanese who in many ways have remained in a very painful place in Chinese collective memory, and hold a very different position from the British, who, once they'd left, were treated with a certain amount of affection, something which has not really been the case for the Japanese in China.
The view that is often held is that Chinese view after the end of the opium wars and the aftermath of that, it's a century of humiliation, as they so call it, right? So how has that shaped? I just want you to expand on the century of humiliation from Chinese perspective, because I'm of the view that to understand the other side, you need to go into their history, right? You need to see where they're coming from. So the century of humiliation and how that impacted, like post their independence, 1945, their historical treaties, how they managed their historical treaties, because for India, historical treaties were to be continued. For China, they were to be reworked, they were to be revisited, right? So if you could expand on that.
You're right. The phrase "century of humiliation" 百年国耻 is a phrase that even today every well-educated Chinese would know and recognize and feel a sort of shiver of horror at, you might say. Just to explain factually what it refers to, essentially the period, you might technically say actually 101 years rather than a straight 100, from 1842 to 1943. Well, why those two dates? Because in 1842, the Qing dynasty was forced to sign a treaty with the British at the city of Nanjing at the end of the First Opium War, a war fought essentially by British trading interests to open up China to the trade in opium, to Christian missionaries, and to the idea of imperialism, more broadly speaking, in a way that the Chinese deeply resented. So this is regarded even today as the first of what are known as the unequal treaties, one signed by two partners, the Chinese side of which was forced into it. And this period ended in 1943 because during the middle of World War II, as a reward for coming in on the Allied side, China was promised that if the Japanese were defeated, all of these treaties would finally end on Chinese soil. So 101 years there. Now, that was, of course, as I said, something that ended technically in 1943. So why should it be so relevant? Why should it be so lively in the minds of so many Chinese today? Well, the fact is that in some ways, China's foreign policy and its sense of itself is still very shaped by that idea of the century of humiliation. The century when Chinese felt at the time, and in retrospect, that any foreign power could come and invade them if they had enough guns, if they had enough economic power. They could essentially bully China into submission. And that's one of the reasons for the often very confrontational behavior that China shows in the present day world. China today is, a huge economic power, massive military. There's no objective reason really why it shouldn't feel quite comfortable about its position. But still in the collective memory, in the education that trains all the leaders as well as the wider population, and that kind of wider sense of China's history over the last 150 years, there is this very strong feeling that China, if it is left to itself, will always find itself being attacked or invaded from outside. And therefore, the most important thing that any Chinese leader can do is to push back and make sure that that humiliation of invasion and occupation is never repeated.
So China has had bitter relations, as you have explained. China has had bitter relations with almost all of its neighbors, all of the countries that surround it, and it has this mindset that either we are to be invaded or we protect ourselves, right? But at the same time, with quite a few, it has also worked towards settling the boundary dispute. In some senses, why hasn't that same courtesy been extended towards India? That why doesn't the Chinese side work towards settling the historical differences with India? Or that why is it in China's interest to keep these historical differences and keep these historical ambiguities alive with regard to India?
So one of the areas, I think, of continued friction in global politics continues to be the India-China relationship, and that's been shown most recently in the horrific battle that's taken place in Galwan. Although it is notable that right now it would appear that there are high-level discussions going on between the Chinese and the Indian side, at least to bring it back to some level of stability, if by no means resolution. Well, I think it's important to note that both sides, India and China, in this story, tell narratives about what's happened that are quite different. You've just given very eloquently what I think is the mainstream Indian narrative, which is that India has tried on various occasions to sort out the border dispute, and essentially China hasn't been willing to do that. Chinese speakers, in fact, this morning I was, as it happened, in a panel discussion in which a Chinese speaker actually spoke quite strongly on the other side and argued that in fact it was China that had made so many attempts to actually try and resolve the question, and that its attempts had not actually been accepted. The problem is, I think, that both countries are in some ways very ancient civilizations, but relatively recent historical constructions in the 20th century, have always had an uncertainty around borders in particular. And this is one of the few occasions when the border is not defined either by a nice clear line of sea, which obviously in some cases, not all, but in some cases gives clarity, or a border that was designated and clearly delineated by some sort of international institution, one way or another. I think in this particular case, because the divergence is so strong between what the Chinese would say is happening at the border and what India says is happening at the border, that the likelihood of any resolution is probably quite low. And my own slightly depressing thought is that I'm afraid that the level of low level, but really very tragic conflict that's happening in the border area will probably continue for quite some time.
Speaking of the conflict between the border area, obviously we have the two personalities, Modi and Xi Jinping, at the helm of each side. But going beyond them, or rather going behind them, can you talk about from the Chinese side the influences of the two great leaders, say Mao and Deng, and how their influences have continued across the Chinese polity in the recent years, and how if it has shaped Xi Jinping
Do you mean in himself or in relation to India?
in himself? How is she either trying to build on the relations of Mao, on trying to build himself on how Mao viewed himself, how Deng viewed himself, or is he trying to, go beyond that more, trying to make himself a new leader? If you could expand on that.
I think Xi Jinping, who is without doubt the most singly powerful leader that China has had in well over a quarter of a century, certainly since Deng Xiaoping, is a very interesting combination in that he is both distinctive, and I'll say in a moment what I think is distinctive about him, but also draws on some of the tactics and strategies of his predecessors. So if we're talking about Mao, the founding, dynastic founder, you might say, of the People's Republic of China, there's one thing which may sound so obvious it almost doesn't need saying, but it needs reminding about Mao and Xi Jinping, which is that they are both communists. They're both Marxist-Leninists. And because China's self-presentation to the world, particularly in its English language format, tends to stress other values such as Confucianism, civilization, China's tradition, it's well worth noting that if you read Xi Jinping's writings and his speeches in Chinese, then actually the language of Marxism, Leninism jumps out at you over and over again. Terms like struggle, terms like contradiction, all of these are reminders that Xi grew up in a very different sort of intellectual atmosphere from the leaders of many other countries, including India, of course, but also certainly countries in the Western world. And understanding that notion that actually the dialectic of struggle, something which Marxists have always grappled with, is very much present in Xi's mind, just as it was present in Mao's mind. But there's one element in which I think, for instance, he's very similar to Deng Xiaoping and not to Mao. Mao believed above all that the way to engage with those contradictions in society, or contradictions amongst the people, as Mao would have said, was to actually foment very populist, very violent politics. And the most notorious example was the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, which was about essentially bypassing the Communist Party itself as an organization, almost destroying it, and Mao instead calling on the youth of China to rise up. Now, I don't think I'm making a particularly exotic statement to say that if there is one thing that Xi Jinping does not want, it is for China's youth to get together and rise up against the party. That is absolutely not on the agenda in any way whatsoever. In other words, he's a guy who's in charge of party control. Yes, there are lots of things that he's willing for society to do. He wants it to become richer. I do believe that Xi Jinping is genuinely committed to poverty alleviation. That is, I think, something he learned during his own exile in rural China in the Cultural Revolution. You asked about things that shaped Xi Jinping. His childhood spent in Shanxi province in a very hard scrabble, very remote part of the countryside, definitely one of those shaping influences. So the poverty reduction story is real, but also so is the authoritarian politics. This is a guy who does not like dissent. This is someone who does not want academics or media or any of these voices to be saying anything that is disruptive or in any way subversive of the party. Famously, a document known just as, I think, document number 9 was issued a few years ago, which said, in China, there is going to be no discussion of constitutionalism, no discussion of liberal democracy, no discussion of judicial independence. So he's laid down his red lines. And Deng Xiaoping, in a sense, was a bit like that. He was perhaps relatively more willing to tolerate a certain amount of dissent. But in the end, as Tiananmen Square showed in 1989, Deng was prepared to draw a blood red line. And I think that Xi Jinping has made it very clear that he too is not someone who in any way is going to tolerate challenge to the party. So there are elements of Mao, there are elements of Deng. The final one that I'll mention, which I think is very much to do with him, is that he's a man of the technological age. In a way that was not true of Mao and Deng, now China is an internet-enabled society. You may have heard of a company called Huawei, very big in China, it must be said. And through that, the creation of a surveillance-based society in which the state knows everything about citizens, but those citizens also get e-commerce, e-government and employment capabilities well beyond almost any other society on earth potentially. All of this makes for a very different sort of authoritarian state. And that's Xi Jinping's China. That's not Mao's, that's not Deng's, that's very much about Xi himself right now.
Professor, you brought up the question of the people of China. It's a technological society. A view that is often held in the West is one of bewilderment and astonishment that if your citizens are living under authoritarian states, how are they, comfortable with this, right? And you have Chinese citizens going abroad. They see all these hallmarks of Western society, that you have freedom, yet they still come back to China. Yet they don't say. I would assume they don't say anything. So, could you explain a bit about the why Xi Jinping has so much hold in the Chinese state, why people are willing to support him, and how is the society structured? How is modern Chinese society structured?
So one of the things that is often very puzzling to those like me who come from liberal societies is how has the Chinese Communist Party managed to genuinely to maintain very high popularity levels at home. I actually was just reading this morning a report from the Ash Center at the Kennedy School of Government in Harvard. So this is not any sort of communist front organization. This is a very prominent American institution. And they point out that statistically, based on very rigorous testing, satisfaction levels at the moment, but over the years with the Chinese government from its own citizens are actually very high. And that's certainly been reinforced by the pandemic, where the Chinese middle classes feel that actually the Chinese government has handled it quite well. This has happened at the same time that international opinion surveys say that China's reputation has fallen very, very significantly in the last few months, and certainly during the COVID pandemic time. So we have this paradox of a society where actually the governing party is not at all liberal democratic, but very top-down authoritarian, and actually genuinely popular. But it's managed to actually do a lot of damage to its reputation overseas. So how do you explain these contradictions? Well, I think it's fair to say that the primary driving characteristic of the Chinese Communist Party is to try and create a base of legitimacy for itself that is not based on election and is not based on the standard liberal idea of independence of institutions or judiciary or media and so forth. Instead, I think that the reason for this popularity comes from a couple of strands. One, and the one that people tend to notice the most, is economic. And you have to look at figures. I mean, you're speaking to me from India at the moment. I don't have the absolute latest statistics, but within the last few years, the rule of thumb that I've seen is that right now, China's per capita GDP is around 10,000 US dollars per head. India, with a relatively similar population size, it's about half of that. So both are middle income countries, but at least per capita right now, China can and does point to India and say that our system has produced twice as much per capita wealth as India's system. Now, I personally think that there are lots of other things, including the ability to participate in politics in India, that make democratic societies, in the end, in the long run, preferable to authoritarian ones. But there's no doubt that China has made a case for its own system that has to be answered rather than just being dismissed in that sense. Other sources of legitimacy also come from issues like the founding of the Chinese Communist Party in recent history. We talked earlier about the century of humiliation and the way in which the Chinese people, through various revolutionary parties, the Chinese nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, and then the Chinese communists, fought back against that. So there are a variety of strands that are used by the Chinese to try and argue that, in fact, they have a basis for legitimacy and satisfaction from the population. It's just not an electoral basis as it is in other countries. And that means the system, you've said, as you pointed out, is very different from what it would be in an elected democracy. Instead, what you have is what the Chinese call a meritocracy. Now, I don't wholly agree with this interpretation, but I understand where it comes from. And this is the idea that you can't vote for the government, you can't change it through voting, but you can actually enter it. You know, anyone, if they can be educated, can take the high school exams, they can study, they can apply to join the Communist Party. If they rise up in that through good performance, they'll get the chance, if they become a politician, maybe to run a city, then run a province. They point out, for good or ill, that there is no way that a Donald Trump could ever have been chosen as president of China, because he would not have had the experience of having to do bureaucratic jobs first through the Chinese bureaucratic system before being allowed the top job. So that is one of the elements of difference in the Chinese system that China's leaders would argue justifies the use of a non-democratic, non-liberal, and in many ways very repressive system to run the country.
Professor, coming to the liberal democracy of India, as it is said, when it comes to foreign policy, we have had many stellar minds that have dominated India's foreign policy. We had Nehru, but in terms of India-China relations, the few that come to mind are Nehru, Rajiv Gandhi, Manmohan Singh. And in light of the foreign policy of all these leaders, how does Modi's foreign policy vis-a-vis China differ? How is it built on the same planks, if any? And how will it change? Has it changed? How does Modi handle China?
I think that the policy of the Modi government in terms of China has both elements of continuity and change. The continuity comes in a sense from the fact that really, across history, but certainly in the modern era, the era of independence, China and India have been neighbors who have to get on at some level, but will always have these sorts of continuing disputes over borders and other areas that in a sense are not surprising, because if you have two countries of that size, that population, that economic significance, it's very hard to know how they can occupy the same space without some sort of friction. People sometimes talk, I think, slightly carelessly about the need for India-China cooperation. My own feeling, to be honest, is that both countries are so different in many ways that I'm not sure that actually cooperation between the two would be easy, although I hope in some sense I'm proved wrong over time. So let's get to the question of what's different about the Modi era and the current government's engagement with China. I think the answer to that is that China has changed so much in terms of its foreign policy in the last 10 years that India has had to adapt. Now, some elements of the foreign policy, again, do remain the same. India has always been concerned, for obvious reasons, first and foremost with the question of Pakistan and how that other relationship with the neighbors actually goes. And China has for many years been a very close ally of Pakistan, thereby creating suspicion in Indian policy circles. But of course, until recently, Pakistan's relationship with China was not part of a much bigger and wider attempt to create all sorts of new global links and connections. And that, of course, has become more solidified in the idea of the Belt and Road Initiative, China's global economic and security framework, in which India, of course, is not going to participate, but nonetheless has to be involved as a neighboring state because of the geography that it's in. And I suspect that the Modi government has had to deal with many of the neighbors that it's got used to essentially becoming connected one way or another to those wider ambitions on the Chinese side. Now, when we say ambitions, we often tend to think immediately of military things, and of course they are relative. But actually, I think the economic story may be more important in the first instance, because of course, by building, say, the Gwadar port in Pakistan, the Chinese give themselves an onlet into the Indian Ocean that could help to reorient trade relations across the Indian Ocean, more broadly speaking, including, of course, into East Africa, where they now have a base in Djibouti. So I think that the Modi government has had to respond by thinking much more carefully and perhaps much more actively about alliances. India's position during most of the Cold War, even after the 62 war, was to try and stay relatively as neutral as possible, and of course to have a close relationship with the USSR, which was unusual for a democratic country at that time. Even now, of course, actually, Russia-Indian relations are much closer than is often publicized. But right now, of course, there is a lot of interest in this question of whether or not the Modi government is going to be more enthusiastic about the Quad, the idea essentially of Australia, Japan, the United States, and India getting together, pooling naval resources, getting strategic priorities together, and essentially using that as a means of trying to face down China in the region. Now, up to now, I think it's fair to say that that the Quad has not been a wholly successfully integrated policy. It may be that now the Modi government will look again and decide whether it wants to commit. But it's also hedging its bets. India, along with Pakistan, joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization a few years ago, a grouping which, of course, is very much led out of Beijing and Moscow, but also in many senses an attempt to try and create a sort of footprint in the Central Asian space, which has always been traditionally much more a Russo-Chinese area. So I think that it's too much to say that India yet has a geostrategic plan in the sense that I think China broadly does. But it's fair to say that the Modi government is probably moving more in that direction than its predecessors really did, although there is really quite a long way to go.
Professor, that was fantastic. Moving from beyond the strategic realm, you mentioned the economic realm, and I want to bring in another aspect here, the people-to-people connect. As you mentioned previously, that the per capita in China is about $10,000. In India, it's about half of that, right? So I just wanted to ask you, how does this economic relation between India and China percolate down to the people? How does that affect the people-to-people relation between India and China? And how if at all, that is there room to build the people-to-people connect between India and China?
The economic relationship between India and China, I think, is one of the most interesting, but in some ways quite ambiguous relations between the two countries. And it's summed up for me in some ways by a statistic or a fact that I heard a few years ago. I don't know if it's still true, but I think it may broadly be true. And it's this: each week, there is not even one flight a day. There are only, I think, 4 flights per week between Beijing and New Delhi. But there are certainly flights every single day between Shanghai and Mumbai. In other words, the economic capitals of these two countries have very frequent and common links, whereas the political capitals don't even have enough business to keep a flight going once a day. So while that's, you know, a simplistic way of looking at it, it's also quite a useful way of understanding how the relationship differs in certain ways. Right now, also, the majority of them, they're important trade partners to each other, but right now there's much more Chinese trade going into India than the other way around. And also the goods that China sends into India, including electronics in particular, are much more high-tech and high value added. So the question is, how can that be used to benefit people on both sides? Well, let's take the Indian side first. Right now, you will not be surprised to hear, you will know, sitting in India where you are right now, there is a lot of controversy about Chinese technology in India as part of a much wider global debate and indeed dispute about Chinese technology. The TikTok app, I believe, has just been banned by the Modi government, I think to the rage of many Indian teenagers, actually, who may not have much appreciated that. I mean, demonetization is one thing, but taking away kids' TikTok is really quite a bold move by the Prime Minister, but I'm sure that he will once again find a way to turn it to his advantage. But joking apart, one of the issues, of course, comes into the question of whether or not the Huawei 5G broadband network would be allowed into India. And many people were very surprised that India was even considering it, considering the caution between the two countries. But of course, the one thing that Huawei has is that it's cheap, it's generally pretty reliable, and it could be installed by the Chinese pretty fast. And in terms of the next stage of India's economic growth, in terms of high value added to the economy, having a really well-functioning 5G broadband network is going to be very important. Now it seems to me pretty certain that Huawei will probably not be taken up by India. But that then leaves the big question of where is that tech going to come from, who's going to pay for it, how expensive will it be, and what will that do in terms of holding back India's economic ambitions. So what this points out is that as China rises in the world, the difficulties that come with taking Chinese investment, Chinese technology, and Chinese influence have to be balanced against the fact that there are also economic costs to not dealing with China. Remember, the Chinese may coerce people in many ways, but nobody is forced into taking Huawei. You can always say no, but if you say no, then there are other quite hard choices that have to be made. Going the other way, I think it's fair to say that there's probably more attention paid to China in India than there is attention paid to India in China. China spends a lot more time thinking about the United States, about Japan, about Russia even, and India is thought of as important, but not perhaps quite in the top category of concerns as far as it's seen that way. But there is, I think, one area where actually Chinese business entrepreneurs have looked with a lot of interest at India, and I think are looking to try and reproduce some of what goes on there. And that's in the way in which, in some sectors, India has managed to create a global services economy. Now, I think one of the reasons, as I alluded to earlier, that it will be easier to do that out of India than China is English language capability, as well as the ability to develop the kind of firms that have created that sort of service sector growth in India. And that particular area is something that I think the Chinese are very interested in. The institutions that have dealt with it, like the IITs and the IIMs, have also been of interest to China, although China's doing a pretty good job these days in its own backyard of producing technological innovation, even though in some areas like management, I still think that it has a long way to go. So it's certainly not the case that there is no interest in India in China. There's a lot, but it's in really quite specific areas, whereas I think India is still looking more to China for obvious reasons as a source of worry rather than necessarily a source of great economic benefit.
Thank you for that, Professor. We have broadly looked at the historical perspectives that shape China, how it is shaped. We know broadly of the historical perspectives that shape India. Now I want to bring in the question of the pandemic, right? Pandemic has upended global order, it has upended global relations, and a lot of criticism has been brought in on China. So I just wanted to ask, how should the world see China? How should the world deal with China? And has the pandemic changed that? And if so, in what direction? And how is it being seen by China and India from both sides?
How the world should deal with China is probably one of the 3 or 4 most important geopolitical questions, along with, of course, the big one, climate change, in which China, of course, is very relevant, along with India. And, of course, the question of how pandemics and other epidemics can be dealt with, which has suddenly become so much more urgent. I think the answer to your question, in a sense, is best given in the most literal form possible, or most factual form possible, which is this: certain things are now objectively true. China is the second biggest economy in the world, even the first according to some measures, but stick with second for the moment. China is a major technological innovator that has managed to produce its own very distinctive, innovative tech ecology. And China is a major military and security superpower that has a permanent seat at the UN Security Council and is looking to use its influence in the wider world. So the question cannot be, how do we, even if you're opposed to China, the question cannot be, how do we stop that? Because it's already happened. The question is, how do we engage with it and make sure that the community that's created as a result is one that happens on shared terms rather than just China's terms? And I think that the short answer I'd give, because of course one could give a very, very long answer, is that there's not a whole lot that we can do about changing China from the inside. It's going to be an authoritarian state of the sort I've described for quite a long time to come. I think it's perfectly legitimate that if we don't like that, we should say openly that we think that China should be more transparent and more liberal and allow more freedoms for individuals. And I think it's perfectly fair to say that. But in the end, that is going to be a question for the Chinese people themselves. It can't be imposed from outside. What I think the rest of the world does have to do is to work out its own consistent common position about what it wants China to do and where its own red lines are. Right now, I will say that I think that the greatest gap in what I've just said is the lack of leadership from the United States. It's all very well pointing out that China is violating this rule or tearing up this particular human rights norm, whatever it might be, all of which I'm sure is entirely true. But if the main leadership actor on the liberal side of the world, the United States, is currently talking about America first, it's talking about leaving huge numbers of international institutions, the World Health Organization is the most recent example. This is not an atmosphere in which other countries can easily get together and actually create a common front, not against China, but in conversation with China with firm, clear red lines about what can be acceptable and what can't be. I think at the moment, the weakness of the liberal world, its inability to speak with the same voice, inability to share priorities, is the greatest problem. And India needs to play a role there too. I mean, we've talked more about China in that sense, but India has for a very long time been a bastion. It's, you know, like all countries, it has all sorts of problems, but it's been a broadly responsible actor in the world. It has had a good role also on the climate change negotiations we've talked about. It's been generally seen as a well-respected actor in diplomatic and economic circles. We mentioned figures who've worked at places like the World Bank and so forth. It's very important that those secular liberal values, which have been an important part of India for a long time and part of its global image, are not compromised in any way. That's one of the gifts that India can continue to give to the world, and it's important that it should continue to do so.
Uh, you have brought me right to my next question. As you said, India is respected widely for its values of tolerance, pluralism, democracy, peaceful engagement, etc., etc. But however, in recent times, we have seen an uptake of international criticism towards India. Merit of those criticisms and actions aside, how do these criticisms affect, if they do, India's position in the neighborhood, particularly Southeast Asia and South Asia? And how can India, in face of China's economic engagement, the Belt and Road Initiative, its initiatives with various countries, work to combat China through, say, pursuing a strategy of soft power and cultural diplomacy?
India has a tremendous number of assets that it can and should use to boost its own position and also to be part of a wider global community in which its values and not just its strength are important. China has managed so far, I think it's fair to say, to become an economic superpower, a military superpower, but not yet a country which around the world is sort of regarded with great approval in terms of the way in which it transmits values. Yes, in terms of some specific things, such as China's, I think, quite genuine commitment to development around the world in certain ways. But because, of course, China has made it clear that individual civil liberties are not something that it prioritizes over economics, and that means basically a repression of dissent within China's territories, that I think has really heavily damaged its ability to create a favorable impression overseas. I think that although we know that India as a democratic state has also had a huge numbers of flaws and difficulties in the 8 decades or so of independence, it has nonetheless over time managed to maintain very strongly the idea that its value lies not in its having a large army or a big navy or even up to now a particularly global type of economy. I mean, China in that sense is much more globalized than India, which remains a country that is still, I think, more concentrated on its domestic economy than going overseas. But with all that being true, I think it's fair to say that figures around the world with the stature of Nehru, with the stature actually of some of the leaders who came later. You mentioned Manmohan Singh, I think earlier, someone who was, I think, very well respected because of his credentials in economics and elsewhere, and also because of what's happened in terms of India being seen as a sort of diplomatic actor in the world. All of these sorts of things are important assets, but they are dependent, of course, on people seeing values at home that they respect and believe are worthwhile. And because India was in some ways such an anomalous and in some ways miraculous state to emerge in 1947 as the world's largest democracy, a country with a secular basis that could accommodate all sorts of traditions, religions, viewpoints, genuine debate, genuine dissent. These things, the awkwardnesses of society, which actually all great free societies have, are one of the things that India has shown. You don't have to be a well-developed Western country. You don't have to be Sweden. You don't have to be Switzerland to have these sorts of values. A country coming into being can also have those values too. And it will be a great shame and actually very damaging to India's international image if those very important qualities were not preserved and cherished.
Interesting, you brought up that fact of India, how India was viewed after independence, especially with relation to the non-aligned movement. I'm sure you would have read Burton Zittner's China's India War or heard of it. Essentially, the argument Burton Zittner makes is that China, in many ways, as both countries were emerging out of the shadow of colonialism and struggle, China, in many ways, was not happy with India's position as the head of the third world or the developing countries, and it initiated the 62 war in order to upend India's position as leader of the third world. Is this the sort of same logic that we are seeing with regard to the incidents at Galwan also, that China at some levels is feeling threatened by India's position and the respect it commands, and it wants to, keep India at a level below itself?
I don't think that either of those interpretations are necessarily hold. In terms of 1962, a lot of analysts, not least on the Chinese side, but not just on the Chinese side, argue that if you look at the signals between Nehru and Mao's government, that it was Nehru's side that miscalculated and not Mao's. Now, there are disputes on both sides. What I'm saying is that for historians of that period, there is quite a lot of ambiguity and difficulty in interpreting exactly which side you want to take on board. What's certainly true is that the Indian public sphere has absolutely come behind the idea that India was the victim. China's public sphere has absolutely come behind the idea that China was the victim, and you'd have to go back to the documents to really discuss the nuances of that. In terms of the present day issue, I don't think that interpretation really holds up because, I'm sorry to say, but China does not regard India as its rival. China regards the United States as its rival. The places that China really regards as being global threats or opportunities are the US, because it's the only superpower really, and China is not a superpower at the standard of the United States. I mean, the United States is declining, but it's declining from such a high level that it's still by far the most powerful actor in the world by some way. China also has a certain amount of respect for the European Union because, of course, it has this huge trading bloc and the ability to set norms around the world. And it also treats warily, but with respect, Russia. And it also treats as an important neighbor, although one with a very painful history, Japan. These are countries where I think it's fair to say that China really spends a lot of time thinking about its foreign policy on the front foot, you might say. India is important to China for reasons I explained earlier, but I don't think there's any sense at all in which today, as China looks at its Belt and Road Initiative, it looks at the fact that people all around the world are talking about whether Chinese influence in Africa is a good idea. Is Chinese influence in Brazil a good idea? Nobody really is talking about whether India's influence in India or Latin America is a major factor. The two are really not comparable in that way.
As we come towards the end of the session, it's been almost a month, 2 months since the situation in Ladakh was sparked at the incident in Galwan. However,
Yeah.
it is only now that we are seeing signs of resolution, both sides moving back. And there has, over this period, there have been many calls by Indian strategists that India should take, very strong steps to deal with China. And in your view, keeping in mind the entire discussion we had, the economic relation, the historic relation, the people to people connect between India, what are the options before India when it comes to resolving and providing a resolution to this latest situation? In your view, if you could expand on that, what are the possible options before India? And how do you see this crisis de-escalating?
As I said earlier, I think in the current circumstances, it seems to me that there's probably not going to be any very good prospect of short-term resolution of this issue, and therefore de-escalation, keeping things relatively calm, is probably the most important short-term goal. To do that, the two sides need to be in as much conversation as possible. Military leaders on both sides need to be talking to each other, and politicians need to be talking to each other as well. It is notable that even though, of course, the area has been a line of conflict for quite some decades, it was actually, something like 40 years since the last lives were lost before the Galwan incident, just this year. So it is possible to keep these things relatively calm. It's also possible, as the Xi-Modi summits have shown both in Beijing and in New Delhi, that the two sides can talk to each other in a reasonable way without having to make the line of control a kind of red line issue that prevents discussion of anything else. But in all these cases, and this is also true of UK-China relations or US-China relations or anything else, continued low-key but constant discussion in which both sides are just talking to each other over and over again, sometimes repeating the same things, sometimes getting a bit bored, but hopefully over time moving forward and seeing where there are areas of nuance or compromise that are possible is the only way. The idea that some grand solution is suddenly going to appear and can be imposed one morning is, I think, fanciful. Unfortunately, most international negotiations over difficult issues take a very long time. They're quite dull in terms of the way in which the everyday negotiation takes place. And you often have to look back a number of years or even decades to see quite how far people have come over time. And I think that work needs to start sooner rather than later when it comes to the China-India border.
Professor, I just wanted to ask you one last question. In many senses, history is political, right? And you have also held that view that history is political. I wanted to ask, how do the Chinese view history, and how has their view of history shaped how? Because recently there were reports coming in the media of China asking libraries to publish correct versions of history, and so I just wanted to ask you that how do the Chinese view history? That's my broad question. You can go on detail in this question.
I think that China is perhaps one of the single most historically minded countries in the world. And you could say there's a sort of perverse compliment to historians in China, that their work is censored and altered and that books are taken off the shelf and it's changed. I can promise you that pretty much no politician in Britain cares enough about history to want to rip books off the shelves and change them. It's not because of free speech, it's just because really history in the end is so little in the minds of politicians here in terms of their understanding their place in the world. In China, it is very different, I think. All sorts of historical references come, instantly to the lips and to the minds of Chinese thinkers about the present and the future. The one I mentioned briefly, I'll just, if I may say again, the book that I have coming out this autumn, China's Good War, is 300 pages about the obsession that China has developed about its role in the Second World War, when admittedly it was a huge victim in many ways, lost many tens of millions of people, but also was an ally in the fight against Japan, and feels very, very angry and resentful that its contribution to defeating the Japanese has not been sufficiently acknowledged by the rest of the world. This is a very live historical issue right now in the 2020s in a way that I think it really isn't for most other countries. There are other references, the Opium Wars we've mentioned, the period of warlord battles in the 1920s, the so-called May 4th movement of 1919, the kind of first cultural flowering of that era. All of these are things that are very much seen as part of the fabric that has created the China of today. So while it's fair to say that average Chinese perhaps don't know huge amounts about the details of history, there are plenty of historical reference points that immediately ring a bell when trying to understand the way that China thinks about certain contemporary issues. And I have often said, and will say again to people who are interested in policy making or in dealing with China, if you want to understand China's future, the best thing you can do is first read a good book of modern Chinese history and start from that point.
Start from that point. Professor, just one last question. As you know, recently in 2019, the fourth plenum of the 19th CCP of the Chinese Central Committee was held. And a key feature of this meeting of top bureaucrats was the advance of the so-called branded fifth modernization of China, where you advance society, and the Xi Jinping thought. I was wondering if you could just advance a bit on those two aspects, the so-called fifth modernization and the Xi Jinping thought, and how do those two tell us about how China views the world, is going to view the world in other senses?
Well, modernization has been a very long-standing demand from the Chinese Communist Party in terms of its own society. And the fifth modernization refers to the kind of next stage beyond the so-called four modernizations instituted by Deng Xiaoping back in the 1970s, which included areas like agriculture, technology, and so forth. Clearly, China's leapt so far beyond that now that it's moving into the next phase. But the importance of Xi Jinping thought, the thought of China's leader, is that the party wants to make it absolutely clear that it is not looking to modernize to create a society that is in any sense an imitation of a liberal or democratic society. It's a society that will be very much controlled not just by the party, but also by the particular leader who is in charge right now. And Xi Jinping thought is used essentially as a new sort of ideological glue to try and bring those ideas together and argue that the China of tomorrow is going to be a modern state, but it is not going to be a liberal state. And by looking at Xi Jinping thought, you can understand that very alternative, quite authoritarian direction in which it's going to go.
And with that, we come to the end of the session. Professor, thank you so much. I think this was a wonderful discussion where we got a broad view of Chinese history, Chinese culture, and Indian culture, how the people-to-people contact between the two nations, and the way forward, from both a world perspective, from a both bilateral perspective and the individual perspective. I just wanted to thank you on my behalf, on Cora's behalf, and our audience for taking out your time and being here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.